Hi, I'm David Flatto, and I'm an instructor here at Drisha. I teach Talmud. In this week's Parashat Beha'alotecha, towards the end, we have a gripping exchange between Moshe and Yehoshua. It happens right after Eldad and Medad are animated with the Spirit of God, and surprisingly have the capacity to have nivuah, to have prophecy. Yehoshua hears of this, and he runs to his master, and he says, Moshe, Klaim, imprison them. This cannot just happen, that we have uncontrolled, unchecked prophecy. To which Moshe has the following moving response. On the contrary, Yehoshua. Verse 29, Mi'iten kolam Hashem neviim. Were it only that everybody had the Spirit of God, were animated with this capacity to have prophecy, to have nivuah. The exchange is moving on its own terms. Should prophecy be limited to those who are elected, those who are designated, those who are institutionalized, or Moshe, the leader who actually has a much more open or charismatic notion? Whoever is animated with the Spirit of God, of course they should deliver God's utterances and God's words. And the ideal is that it's not limited just to institution. It goes to everybody. But I think there's actually another dimension to Moshe's comment that has a particular resonance right here in this chapter. To understand that in a deeper sense, we have to look throughout the chapter. Chapter 11 of Bamidbar is actually a tightly constructed chapter. There's a milah mancha that runs through the entire chapter. It's from the Shorish Asaf, to gather. It appears throughout the entire chapter, bringing it together and showing it it's one tight unit. Look, if you're following along in your Tanakh, which you're encouraged, chapter 11, verse 4, Asafsuf, the Asafsuf, the gathering, of course the problematic gathering who started the complaining. But that same term continues throughout the chapter. Look in verse, and I've jotted it down for myself so we can follow along, verse 16. Moshe says, Asfali shivimish, gather for me 70 people. Or in verse 22, Moshe says, how can I gather kol degei hayam yasef lahem? Can I gather so much meat or fish, etc., to satisfy all of them? That same term. Or again in verse 24, vayesof shivim ish, that Moshe gathers 70 people. Notice the word asaf is being applied in all sorts of different senses, but it's that same term. Or again in verse 30. Verse 30 says, vayesof Moshe, that Moshe gathers to the camp. And then finally in verse 34, it says, 32, Vayesfu et haslav, they gather the Slav. So the repeated occurrences of this term just point to the fact that this is a tightly constructed chapter, as I said. So what is the layout of this chapter, and what is its message? Actually, if you describe it outside, the chapter is easy enough to follow. But when you look inside, it's actually more nuanced. Let's first describe it outside. What happens is that there is a complaint among the people, beginning with Asafsuf, and then going through the rest of the people, complaining that they want meat. Moshe and God are highly dejected when they hear that this is the request of the people. And Moshe launches into a specific complaint to God that he can't handle the people anymore, and he needs the support of other leaders. To which God responds that indeed that's a good idea, and Moshe should be supported with other leaders. So in the continuation of the chapter, we have to sort of solve these two different problems. One, getting Moshe's support staff of the 70 leaders, and two, satisfying the people's highly problematic and disappointing request for more meat. And through the midst of all of this, there are exchanges between God and Moshe. So all of that makes sense outside. But when you follow it inside, there seems to be these two parallel processes that are being interwoven. And we don't fully appreciate why should they be interwoven. One is the process of giving meat to the people. That, of course, is initiated by their problematic request. The people need meat. The other process is Moshe needs a support staff. And here the support staff is not just people who could help him delegate the meat, or maybe even down the road, who could be fellow leaders or fellow counselors. But apparently it's important right now that Moshe is supported with a support staff that is actually the most qualified of support staffs actually themselves having the Spirit of God or prophetic capacities. And it's actually sort of confusing when you read the chapter how it weaves back from one process to the other. The process that the people need their meat, and the process that Moshe should have a support staff that's animated by the Spirit of God and needs prophetic capacity. And the chapter weaves back and forth between both these processes, sort of surprising to the reader. So if you look, for example, in chapter 11, verse 16, Moshe begins one process of gathering 70 elders. And if you look in chapter 11, verse 18, Moshe begins the other process that the people should get ready to receive the meat. But the chapter goes back and forth between these two different processes. It's perhaps most jarring in verse 24. I'll read this one out loud. Vayetzeh Moshe vayidaber al ha'am et divrei Hashem. Moshe goes out and tells the people God's word. What's with what he tells the people? He tells them that they should get ready to receive the meat. And then that very same verse 24 continues, Vayesof shivim ish miziknei ha'am. And Moshe gathers 70 people. Well, which process are you in the midst of, Moshe? Verse 24, Moshe is in the midst of both processes simultaneously. One process is telling the people to get ready for the meat, and the other is telling the 70 people to get ready to receive God's Spirit. They both are happening at once. So the entire chapter seems to be about asifah, about gathering, but actually two gatherings which are happening simultaneously. One gathering is the people gathering to receive the meat, and the other gathering are the 70 elders who are gathering to receive actually the opposite of meat, God's Spirit. That's verse 29. Verse 29, of course, has to be juxtaposed to verse 3. What's verse 3? I'm turning back. The people gather and they say, Mi yachilenu basar. Who will give us meat? To which verse 29 closes the chapter, and Moshe says, Mi yitain, were it only that everybody has ruach. There are two different versions or visions of gathering here. Two different versions of a gathering, two different visions of a human request. Human beings are complicated creatures. They could have the most base of desires. Mi yitnenu basar. All of humanity could just be reduced to the most base of requests. We need our meat. That's one kind of human request. And then Moshe recognizes that humans also have an opposite capacity. And that's the wonder of the Eldad Umedad episode. That even human beings who we don't expect it from suddenly find within them the capacity to have ruach, to transcend themselves, to be animated with the Spirit of God. Chapter 11 poses before us the range of human capacities. Human beings could pursue the most base of desires of basar, or the most lofty of aspirations of ruach. The challenge of chapter 11 is to join Eldad and Medad for that most lofty of aspirations. Shabbat Shalom.